My daughter sold my $5 million lakeside mansion secretly and sent me a check of $20,000 with a note which read, "You are an old man and you don't need too much money. Take this and forget about my existence." What happened next was rather unbelievable. I will tell you everything. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Sam Graham from London. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October when I first held that envelope in my hand. Thin, plain white, no return address. I was sitting by the window in my room at Silver Pines Retirement Community, a place that always smelled faintly of boiled vegetables and lavender disinfectant. Outside, the lake shimmered like a sheet of crushed glass under the pale autumn sun, and the wind stirred the trees in a way that made me feel, as it often did lately, like time was pulling me somewhere I didn't want to go. I had been living there for almost 6 months, ever since the second stroke, the one that took the strength out of my right hand and the steadiness out of my speech. I was still sharp, still reading the paper every morning, still keeping up with the markets and checking in weekly with my lawyer. But the body was no longer mine. I opened the envelope slowly, my left hand fumbling with the edges while my right lay useless on the blanket across my lap. A check slid out first. I blinked, squinting to make sure I saw it right. $20,000. My heart started a slow, deliberate thump. The figure wasn't what shocked me. It was the insult of it, the absurd, almost comedic smallness of it. My eyes moved to the note tucked behind it. It was in her handwriting. That looping, half-cursive script I had last seen on a birthday card 5 years ago. The paper trembled as I read the words. "You are an old man, and you don't need too much money. Take this and forget about my existence." That was it. No love, Marissa. No dad. Just that cold message, like she was doing me a favor by erasing herself from my life. I sat there for a long time after reading it, unable to feel anything fully, like my brain and my body were trying to process it on different frequencies. My chest was tight, but I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years. Not even when they buried my wife, Janine, 10 years earlier. But this was a different kind of grief. A cruel, aching burn that came not from loss, but from the clarity of knowing that someone you once held in your arms as a baby, someone you read bedtime stories to and bought first cars for, had decided you were nothing more than a line item on their balance sheet. I had always known Marissa was distant, cold even. But this was betrayal in its purest, ugliest form. The mansion was supposed to be my final gift to myself, the fruit of decades of 12-hour days and business deals forged over steak dinners and late-night flights. I had designed every room in that lakeside property myself, imported the stone from Vermont, chose the wood beams from Oregon, and had the garden landscape to look like the ones Janine used to sketch in her journals. It was never meant to be just a house. It was my retirement, my solace, my shrine to a life I had built with my own 2 hands. And now, someone had tried to sell it like it was an old chair at a garage sale. I picked up the phone and dialed Paul Renner, my attorney for over 30 years and the one man I trusted outside of blood. He picked up on the second ring, his voice crisp and concerned as always. I told him what I had received. There was a pause, then a sharp inhale. "Don't worry," he said. "She tried, but we saw it coming." I sat up straighter in my chair, the world tilting slightly beneath me. Paul explained that 2 weeks ago, someone had submitted forged documents to a luxury property brokerage in town, claiming to have my authorization to sell the mansion. The agents had reached out to Paul to verify everything. He played along, got copies of the documents, and handed them to a private investigator. The signatures were fake. The IDs were doctored. But the deal was already in motion. Marissa had even convinced a buyer. What she didn't know was that every conversation, every email, every handshake had been watched. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not just from anger, but from humiliation. How many people had seen her try to erase me? How many knew that my own daughter thought me so disposable? She could forge my name and send me off with pocket change. Paul's voice came back on the line, calm and firm. "The police are involved now. We're letting them handle it. You just stay put and take care of yourself." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I mumbled a thank you and hung up. I looked around my room, suddenly hyper-aware of how small it was. A bed, a dresser, a recliner by the window. Pictures of Janine and Marissa when she was young, before the coldness set in, before she started resenting everything I did. There was a time when she used to draw me pictures and tape them to my office door. A time when she would run to me when I came home from work, arms flailing like windmills. But something changed in her after Janine died. She stopped talking as much, stopped coming home from college. When she did visit, it was always a performance, smiles for show, but eyes like frostbite. Still, I had hoped. I had tried, paid off her debts more than once, gave her the down payment on that townhouse, offered her a job at the firm, which she turned down because real estate was for soulless people. And now here she was, forging my signature, trying to sell my legacy and cut me out of my own life like a tumor. But the worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the note. That one sentence, written without hesitation, like I was an inconvenience, an old man too close to death to be worth the trouble. I looked down at my hands. Wrinkled, yes. Weak, yes. But not dead. Not yet. The sun had dipped lower outside, casting a long orange streak across the lake. I sat back and exhaled, the kind of long, slow breath you take when you know a storm has only just begun. There was going to be fallout. Headlines, maybe. Courtrooms. Her face on the news. And I knew, deep down, I'd never see her the same way again. She was no longer my daughter. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the way that would ever heal. But strangely, beneath the anger and the sorrow, I felt something else stirring, a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in years. They had written me off, the world, my own flesh and blood. But I was still here, still fighting, still watching the lake from this old recliner, still remembering the man I had been and the life I had built. And now, I was going to make damn sure no one stole that from me again. The next morning started quiet, almost deceptively so, like the world had hit pause for a moment just to give me space to gather my thoughts. I sat in the dining hall with my usual bowl of oatmeal, watching the steam rise and disappear into the bland beige light. Around me, the other residents shuffled through their routines, some watching morning TV, some flipping through magazines with trembling fingers, some just sitting, staring out the window like they were waiting for something that would never arrive. I felt a kinship with them, not because we were all old, but because we all carried that same weight. The ache of being forgotten, slowly, quietly, like a book no one picks up anymore. But unlike most of them, I still had unfinished business. I had a storm coming. Paul called right after breakfast. His voice, though even as ever, had a trace of urgency in it. "The paperwork's been submitted to the county clerk," he said. "We got her attempt blocked in time, but barely. She forged your signature using old forms from your safe. The scary part? She knew the codes. She had help." My hand tightened on the phone, even as the tremor from my stroke made it hard to keep it steady. That safe had been at the mansion for decades, tucked behind a bookshelf in the study. Only two people had the combination, me and Marissa, because I had given it to her in good faith when she was 23, fresh out of college, and I still believed that trust was the same thing as love. Paul wasn't done. She went through a luxury brokerage downtown, pretended to be your authorized financial agent. The buyer was some tech guy from Silicon Valley, eager to have a waterfront trophy home. He was ready to wire the down payment this week. I let that sink in. My home, my life, almost vanished behind my back, traded for a quick profit and a lie. And Marissa, my own daughter, had stood in those halls and signed those papers like it meant nothing. Like she wasn't selling the last thing that still made me feel whole. Paul continued. The buyer's team asked for verification. That's when we caught the discrepancies. Her ID didn't match her estate records. The notary was fake. We brought in a private investigator, followed her, got recordings, documents, everything. I closed my eyes and pictured her, standing in my study, using my pen, touching my things like she had any right. And then I pictured Janine, sitting across from me at that same desk 20 years ago, laughing about the crooked contractor who tried to overcharge us for the patio stone. That room had held our life together, and Marissa had tried to gut it. There's something particularly painful about realizing someone doesn't just hate you. They resent everything you've ever loved. That house wasn't just real estate. It was where Janine and I spent our final anniversary, where I taught Marissa to ride her first bike on the sloped driveway, where I kept a bottle of her mother's perfume in the master bath, still half full, because I couldn't bear to throw it out. And yet Marissa looked at all of that and saw a dollar sign. I suppose in her mind, I had already died. Easier to pretend I was gone than face what she'd become. I asked Paul what the next steps were. Police are investigating. Fraud, forgery, attempted grand larceny. We'll let them move forward with charges. I asked him if it would go to trial. He paused. Likely yes, unless she confesses and settles. But based on her behavior, don't count on that. That's when I made a decision, not out of revenge, but self-preservation. I told Paul, go through with everything. No leniency. I want her to face every consequence. There was a pause, then a quiet, understood. I hung up, feeling like I had just signed a different kind of deed, one that closed a chapter forever. That afternoon, I wheeled myself to the community room and sat in my usual corner by the window. Across from me sat Alan, a retired teacher who spent most of his time solving crossword puzzles in ink. He looked up from his paper and said, "You look like a man who's just made peace with something." I gave a dry laugh. More like a man who's finally accepted war. He tilted his head. Family. I nodded. He didn't press further. Just handed me a pencil. Here, in case you want to mark the things that still matter. It was a simple gesture, but it landed hard. I realized that while Marissa had tried to take everything from me, she hadn't succeeded. Not entirely. I still had control. I still had clarity. And I still had allies. Later that evening, one of the nurses, Tamika, a young woman with a sharp wit and a soft heart, poked her head into my room with a sympathetic smile. "Heard you had a rough day, Pops," she said, using the nickname she'd given me. I shrugged. "Just cleaning house." She sat on the arm of the chair and said, "Well, if you ever want to burn something, I know a guy." I chuckled, genuinely this time. There was something healing in her presence, the way she didn't treat me like a relic. I told her a bit, just enough, that my daughter had tried to sell my home, that the law was now involved. She didn't gasp or offer fake sympathy. She just said, "Some people think blood is currency. Glad you know your worth." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what love had cost me. Not the romantic kind. I had known deep, real love with Janine. But the love I gave Marissa, the love that never seemed to be enough, had come at a price. I had excused too much, overlooked too many red flags, told myself she'd come around, that grief had just made her cold. But maybe the truth was simpler. Maybe she had never learned to love anything she couldn't control. And when I didn't hand her everything she wanted, she decided to take it. Still, I didn't hate her. I wanted to. It would have been easier, cleaner. But hate is a living thing. It requires energy. What I felt now was emptier, quieter, like a door that had finally shut, sealing off a room I no longer had to visit. I would never understand what turned her into the kind of person who could do this. But I understood now that my job wasn't to fix it. It was to protect what was left of me. The next morning, the headlines started to spread. Not national news, not yet. But the local outlets had picked it up. Daughter of prominent developer accused in $5 million property fraud. Her picture was there, her mugshot sharp and unrepentant. The comment section was brutal. People always think they know a family from the outside, but they didn't know what it was like to watch someone you raised morph into a stranger. They didn't know what it was like to hold that check in your hand and realize it was meant to be a goodbye. The final day of the trial came sooner than I expected. Court cases, I had always assumed, dragged on endlessly, tangled up in technicalities and delays. But this one moved like a machine that had been waiting years to power on. The evidence was airtight. The motives were clear. The betrayal was public, painful, and impossible to deny. And yet, even with all of that, part of me kept waiting for the twist, for the moment when Marissa would finally soften, show even the smallest glimmer of remorse, or offer some explanation that wasn't laced with entitlement or rage. But that moment never came. When she entered the courtroom that morning, I noticed she wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was pulled back, plain and tight, and her suit looked wrinkled from a rough night's sleep. She didn't look at me. Not once. It was as if I had become another witness, another obstacle to get around. And in a way, I suppose I had. To her, I wasn't a father anymore. I was the gatekeeper of a fortune she thought she was owed. Watching her sit down with her attorney, calmly reviewing papers, I wondered if she ever thought about the simpler times. Birthday parties in the backyard, movie nights, the time I stayed up all night to help her build a diorama of the solar system because she'd forgotten it was due the next day. Did she remember those things? Or had she rewritten the story so thoroughly in her mind that I was nothing more than the villain she needed me to be? The prosecutor gave his closing statement with quiet precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply laid out the facts: a forged power of attorney, fraudulent real estate contracts, stolen documents, and an elderly father blindsided by the betrayal of his only child. When he was done, the judge turned to Marissa's lawyer, who stood and straightened his tie like he was about to make the speech of his life. But he didn't. He simply said, "My client maintains that she believed she had the authority to act on behalf of her father, and that any misunderstanding was a result of poor communication, not malicious intent." It was weak, hollow, and even he knew it. Then the judge spoke. Her voice was firm, unyielding. She talked about trust, about legal boundaries, about the responsibility we carry when dealing with the affairs of others, especially our elders. But then she paused. She looked directly at Marissa and said, "What disturbs this court the most is not just the fraud, but the clear emotional detachment with which you carried it out. You didn't act in desperation. You acted with calculation. And you never once asked yourself if what you were doing was right, only whether you could get away with it." The sentence was swift. 20 years. No parole for the first 12. I didn't move. I didn't cheer. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. Marissa's face didn't change. No tears. No outburst. Just a quiet, distant look, like she was watching the scene unfold from somewhere else entirely. As the bailiff approached to take her into custody, she finally turned toward me. Just a glance. No words. No apology. Just that same cold, unreadable expression she'd worn the day she mailed me the check. Then she was gone, escorted through the side door and swallowed by the justice system. Paul leaned in and whispered, "You did the right thing." I nodded, but my chest felt heavy, like someone had placed a stone on top of my heart. The right thing. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Like crawling out of a burning house with nothing but your name. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some reporters, some curious onlookers. One woman, probably in her 30s, walked up to me with a microphone and asked, "Do you have anything to say to your daughter?" I stared at her, stunned for a moment. I wanted to say 1,000 things. I wanted to tell her how much it hurt. How much I still remembered holding Marissa's hand as she crossed the street for the first time. How I used to kiss her forehead every night, even when she pretended to be too old for it. But instead, I said, "I hope she finds something in there that makes her want to be better. But that's no longer my burden to carry." And with that, Paul gently guided me to the car. Back at Silver Pines, word spread fast. Even the residents who didn't know how to use the remote control for the television had somehow heard about it. A few gave me polite nods of sympathy. One woman, Doris, who never spoke more than a whisper, left a slice of banana bread outside my door with a note that read, "Some things rot even when you water them. Doesn't mean the gardener was bad." I stared at that note longer than I should have. She was right. I had watered. I had tried. But some people choose decay. Tamika came in that evening during her shift. She sat on the edge of my bed like she always did, cracking open a soda from the vending machine. "You okay, Pops?" she asked. I shrugged. Not sure yet. She nodded like she understood. "You know, I used to think forgiveness was about saying it's okay to people who hurt you. But I think now it's just about letting go of the hope they'll fix it." I looked at her, surprised. "That your quote?" She grinned. "Nah, Instagram. But still true." I turned toward the window, watching the sun lower itself behind the lake. The water looked different now. Not darker, just deeper somehow. Like it held more than just reflections. Like it had swallowed years of my memories, pain, joy, regret, all folded into the same soft ripple. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to step back into that mansion again. The house itself hadn't wronged me, but it had been violated, like someone had walked through a church with muddy boots. Still, it was mine, still standing. And maybe, one day, I'd walk through those halls again, not as a man looking backward, but as a man reclaiming what hadn't been taken. Before Tamika left, she said, "You ever think about writing all this down?" I gave a bitter chuckle. "What? So it can sit in a drawer until someone decides to toss it?" She smiled. "No. So someone who needs to hear it might someday stumble across it and say, 'I'm not crazy.'" That happened to me too. I didn't answer. But that night, I pulled out an old notebook from my drawer. The first page was still blank. The first time I stepped back into the mansion, it was raining. Not a heavy, cinematic kind of storm, but a soft, persistent drizzle that blanketed the lake and clung to the tall glass windows like fogged breath. Paul insisted on accompanying me, though I told him it wasn't necessary. I think he knew better. He parked at the top of the driveway and waited as I slowly made my way to the front door, cane in hand, boots heavier with each careful step. The house looked exactly as I remembered it. Untouched, pristine, but as I turned the key and pushed open the door, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a museum of my past, every shadow whispering with memories that now sat in conflict with what had been nearly stolen from me. The silence inside was absolute. No echo of footsteps on the hardwood floors, no rustle of drapes from a passing breeze, no laughter from the woman who used to dance in the kitchen while pasta boiled on the stove. I stood there in the foyer, hands still on the doorknob, just breathing in the faint scent of wood polish and distant lavender, the last trace of Janine's favorite candles. For a moment, the stillness felt peaceful, but then I glanced toward the study, and the peace cracked like glass underfoot. That was the room where she had taken the documents. That was the place where Marissa had stood, alone, forging her father's name to a future that didn't belong to her. I forced myself to walk through the house anyway. Each room held pieces of a life I used to live, a life that had unraveled without making a sound. The living room still had the leather sectional we'd picked out as a family, and the dented spot on the left cushion where Marissa used to curl up with a book, long before cell phones and teenage bitterness took over. The kitchen counters were spotless, but I could still see the flour stains from that one Christmas morning when she and Janine tried to bake cookies and ended up covering each other in powdered sugar like two mischievous snowmen. Those memories hit hard, not because they were painful, but because they were pure. They were reminders of a time before resentment, before inheritance, before betrayal. When I reached the master bedroom, I paused. The door was half open, and through it I saw the unmade bed, exactly as I'd left it the last time I slept there, months before the stroke, before the care home, before everything shifted. There was a worn armchair by the window, one Janine used to sit in with her tea, watching the lake in early morning silence. I walked toward it slowly and sat down, the cushion sagging under my weight like it remembered me. From that spot, the view was nearly perfect. Rain dripped from the eaves, tiny rivulets racing each other down the glass. The lake was calm, quiet, mirroring the sky with a kind of obedient sadness. And that's when I noticed the chair across from me, the one that used to be hers. Empty, slightly tilted, dust settling into the fabric. Something about that image undid me. I had held firm in the courtroom. I had stood tall in front of the cameras. I had even watched my daughter be sentenced without flinching. But that empty chair broke something inside me. I sat there for what must have been an hour, staring at it, remembering how Janine would talk to me from that very spot, even when I wasn't listening. She used to say, "You're always building things, but you forget that love is something you have to maintain." God, how right she had been. Eventually, I stood and made my way back downstairs. Paul was in the kitchen, quietly organizing some mail that had been forwarded there. He looked up when I entered, eyes scanning my face for signs of emotional fallout. "You all right?" he asked. I gave a nod I didn't mean. "Still mine?" I replied, voice gravelly from disuse. He walked over and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "She didn't take it from you, you know? She tried, but she failed." I looked around at the walls, the paintings, the shelves still lined with Janine's favorite books. "She didn't fail," I said quietly. "She took something, just not what she thought she was stealing." I stayed at the house for a few days after that, trying to find some new rhythm in a space that had once held so much love and Now, so much grief. The neighbors stopped by. Mr. Heller brought over a casserole, and his wife gave me a long, awkward hug. They didn't ask about Marissa, which I appreciated. Everyone in town had seen the headlines. The story was out. The betrayal, the trial, the sentencing. It had become a local legend overnight. I was now that man. The one whose daughter tried to sell his life out from under him. The one who didn't flinch. But what they didn't know was that every night I sat on the back porch, looking out at the lake and wondering how love could die so quietly, so completely. On the third night, I was joined by someone unexpected. Jonas, the caretaker's son. He was in his late 20s now, lanky, thoughtful, and he used to mow my lawn back when he was in high school. He had heard I was back and came by unannounced, holding 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag of donuts. "Didn't know if you were eating much," he said, handing them to me. We sat in silence for a bit, sipping our drinks, the sound of crickets humming beneath the rain. Then he said, "You know, when I was younger, I used to think you were the richest man in town. Not because of the house, but because every time I saw you and your wife, you were smiling." That hit me harder than I expected. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that people had been watching us all along. They'd seen the good before they saw the bad. "She tried to take that away," I said finally. "My daughter. She tried to bury it." Jonas shook his head. "Nah, something stick. No matter what happens after." He stood to leave, placing his hand on the railing. "This place still feels like a home, sir. Just needs someone living in it again." And then he walked off, disappearing into the misty night. That was the moment I made my decision. I wasn't going back to Silver Pines. Not permanently. I would visit, maybe, check in on the friends I'd made, the nurses who cared. But I was reclaiming this house. Not because I needed to prove a point, and not because I was running from what happened, but because I needed to remind myself that I hadn't been defeated. Marissa had tried to erase me, to write me out of my own story. But I was still here, and I wasn't leaving. The next morning, I started making calls. Cleaners, security, restoration services. Not to change the house, just to revive it. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls like I was blessing them. I even found Janine's old sketchbook in the upstairs closet, its pages still filled with garden layouts and soft pencil drawings of the lake view. I pressed it to my chest and whispered a promise to her. I would protect what we built, even if it meant doing it alone. And as I walked past the study, I paused. On the desk, I left the note Marissa had written me, the one that had started all this. I didn't shred it, didn't burn it, just left it there, like a scar I no longer needed to hide. I had chosen peace, not because I was weak, but because I finally understood that peace wasn't the absence of pain. It was the refusal to let pain define what came next. It's strange how quickly people stop talking about something once the immediate drama is over. After the sentencing, after the articles and whispered gossip faded, the world around me seemed to forget. The scandal that had rippled through the town's coffee shops and Facebook groups was replaced by the next story: someone's divorce, a politician's affair, the local high school winning regionals. But I didn't forget. Every morning I woke up and passed the hallway mirror, I saw the same man. Older, yes, a little slower, but not broken. Not erased. I had survived being betrayed by the only child I had, and somehow, I was still standing. Life in the mansion settled into a kind of quiet rhythm. I hired a part-time caretaker, a sweet, no-nonsense woman named Lillian who had no patience for pity but made a perfect cup of coffee. She helped me with groceries, drove me to my doctor's appointments, and took over the garden Janine once cherished. Some mornings, I'd catch her humming to herself while pruning the hydrangeas, and for a moment, it would feel like something close to the life I used to have. Not the same, but close enough that I could breathe without the past clawing at my throat. I found myself spending long hours by the lake again, bundled in a wool sweater, a notebook open on my lap. I wasn't writing stories, just thoughts, bits of memory, pieces of me that I didn't want to lose. Marissa never wrote from prison. Not once. No apology, no explanation, no attempts at softening the damage. I checked the mailbox for a while, not because I hoped, I didn't, but because I wanted to see what silence looked like when it came in an envelope. After a few months, I stopped checking altogether. Whatever she had to say, it didn't matter anymore. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. That kind of betrayal leaves a wound too deep for reconciliation. What it needed wasn't forgiveness. It needed a boundary, a final one. Every now and then, I heard murmurs that her fiancé had left her, that her kids were living with their paternal grandparents, that she'd tried and failed to appeal the sentencing. I didn't ask for these updates. They came to me anyway, through neighbors, old friends, the occasional sympathetic stranger who thought I might want to know. But I didn't. Not really. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't bitter. I just wasn't interested in holding space for someone who had thrown me away so easily. What mattered now were the small things. I rejoined the local book club, not because I cared much for the books, but because I missed the sound of voices in the living room. I started playing chess again with Jonas, the caretaker's son, who came by every Friday and always lost on purpose. I could tell, but I appreciated the gesture. I even went back to Silver Pines once a month, just to sit with the old crew and share stories over Jell-O and tepid coffee. They treated me like a legend there, not because of the scandal, but because I had walked through fire and still remembered how to smile. One afternoon, while sorting through the attic, I found an old photo album Janine had made for our 25th anniversary, leather-bound, with faded gold lettering on the cover. Inside were pictures of every place we'd ever loved: Paris in spring, the tiny cabin in Maine where we honeymooned, the lake house before it became the mansion. And tucked at the very back, behind a pressed tulip and a handwritten note that simply said, "Still my favorite adventure," was a photo of Marissa as a toddler, sitting on my lap, both of us laughing at something off camera. My hair was darker then. Her eyes were softer. That picture didn't make me cry. It didn't even make me angry. It made me grateful, because it reminded me that once, for a time, there was love. It just didn't last. And that's okay. On my 78th birthday, Lillian surprised me with a small gathering. Nothing elaborate. Just a few of the neighbors, some of the nurses from Silver Pines, Jonas and his fiancée. They brought cake, played music from the 70s, and told stories about things I had long forgotten. At one point, I stood by the window, looking out at the lake, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not joy exactly, but its quieter cousin, contentment. I wasn't healed. I wasn't whole. But I was okay. And sometimes, that's more than enough. After everyone left, I stayed up late, sitting in Janine's old chair with the photo album open on my lap. The fire crackled beside me, casting flickering shadows on the wall. I thought about all the ways my life had twisted and turned, about the things I built, the people I lost, and the one betrayal that changed everything. And then I thought about peace. Real peace. The kind you don't find by running away or pretending you're fine. The kind you earn by facing the worst of it and saying, "You don't get to break me." I could have chosen to dwell in the bitterness, to let Marissa's actions define the rest of my days. But I chose instead to return to what I loved, to my home, my memories, and the people who had shown up when it mattered. I didn't need reconciliation. I didn't need closure. I needed space to breathe. And I found it. Now, every morning, I make myself a small breakfast, just eggs, toast, and a cup of coffee. I sit by the lake and write a few lines in my notebook. Some days they're about Janine. Some days they're about the sound of rain. And sometimes they're just about how good it feels to be here, still alive, still grounded, still me. Marissa may have tried to sell my life for a check and a clean conscience, but what she didn't understand, what she never understood, was that peace can't be bought or stolen. It has to be chosen. And I chose it. If you've ever had to walk away from someone you loved just to protect your peace, I want you to know you're not alone. Tell me in the comments, what did choosing peace look like for you? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love, betrayal, and the strength it takes to let go. See you soon in the next story.